It's a real pleasure to talk to you. I will give you basically a presentation from the PowerPoint. Happy to answer questions. Probably at the end, but if someone has questions, maybe Belinda can kind of check people raising their hand or something like that. So I am the executive director of ASWB, and I do all the lobbying, all the questions that people have about certification licensure. And I will start. I'm going to share my screen and get started here. And let me get this. So if anybody can't see this, the definitions, please let me know, speak up. So Wisconsin has what's called title protection, which is something very important everybody should understand. What that means is in Wisconsin, you can't use the title social worker in any form. You can't represent yourself to the public as a social worker or use the title certified social worker, advanced practice, certified independent or licensed clinical, unless you're certified or licensed. So we have what's called title protection. Not every state has that. And then you can't, the other thing we do have in Wisconsin is clinical social work and psychotherapy is protected, and you cannot provide clinical social work or we can't provide clinical social work services unless you're a clinical social worker, and nobody can provide psychotherapy unless they're in one of the professions which license you to do so. We have 4 categories of regulation. So I forgot to ask if you're just, this is BSW, MSW, or mixed, but BSWs would apply for the CSW upon graduation. MSWs would apply for the CAPSW. Those of you that are going on to become licensed clinical social workers, want to be psychotherapy, once you've completed your 3,000 hours, and I'll go through all the requirements, you would apply for the LCSW. The CISW is kind of an anachronism. I am one of a very small group of people that do have that. It's kind of an independent practice for people that aren't clinical, but the requirements are the practice requirements are no different. It doesn't enable you to do anything else that you couldn't do as a CAPSW, but there is still that category. So certified social worker holds a bachelor's or master's degree in social work by an accredited program like UW-Madison, and they're certified and will go through the process by the Department of Safety and Professional Services. Someone who's a CSW cannot do psychotherapy even if they get their MSW. So if you're a CSW and then you go on and get your MSW through Madison or whoever, I mean, some people are in the joint program. If you want to do any psychotherapy, you have to get your CAPSW to do so. It's in the law. You cannot do it simply with the CSW. So certified advanced practice social worker, that's what for people who get their MSW would apply for, or a PhD. Certified advanced practice social workers may engage in psychotherapy under supervision. Certified independent social worker, which very few people have. I happen to have that. I was grandfathered in when everything went into effect in '95. They've completed 3,000 hours of postgraduate full-time social work practice. This is non-clinical, and you're certified. They can also engage in psychotherapy if properly supervised. And anybody that wants to go from a CAPSW to a CISW would be supervised by either another CISW or an LCSW. Now, the LCSW, this is where a lot of, probably majority of the people who get their CAPSW, but not everybody, go on for an LCSW. So this could be someone either with a master's or PhD in social work And I'll go through these definitions. I'm going to say the words, but I'll explain them. They have a clinical social work concentration, has received supervised clinical field training and completed a supervision practice regimen that's licensed by Department of Safety Professional Services. An LCSW can engage in psychotherapy without supervision. Now let me go through some of the requirements for social work licensure. Obviously, you have to have an MSW. For people going for their 3,000 hours in Wisconsin, you must have a CAPSW. You cannot accrue a single hour towards your 3,000 hours until you are a CAPSW. Coursework. So Wisconsin, this is not true in many other states, but Wisconsin requires three kind of specific courses. One is psychopathology and social work, which is very specific. And then two additional clinical courses that are pretty broad. And if you go into the DSPS website, you'll find all the information there, dsps.wi.gov. You click on professions and then scroll down until you get to the LCSW, licensed clinical social worker, and and everything I'm talking about you will find on the website, and I'll list the two additional clinical courses, but it's pretty much just about anything that's direct service courses, not macro, but kind of direct service, working with kids, working with families, working with elderly, etc. But the psychopathology and social work, that's very specific. Either has to have the title or it has to have the content. And then I'll go through what this is, but so in Wisconsin, in order to qualify to take the national exam and the state exam, if you haven't already taken it, but to take the national exam, you have to have 3,000 hours of supervised clinical practice, of which 1,000 hours is direct client contact. And of those 1,000 hours, at least 600 has to be doing psychotherapy, DSM diagnosis and psychotherapy. That's right there. 600, 1,000 hours must consist of DSM diagnosis and psychotherapeutic treatment. Most people get supervision by their employment supervisor, but that is not required. And some people are not able to do so, and they may need to contract with somebody, which is acceptable. So what sort of work experience will count towards 3,000 hours? So they providing primary mental health treatment, including psychotherapy, for a client using DSM diagnosis to assess, diagnose, and treat persons with mental disorders. So our clinical licensure, unlike some other states, is very psychotherapeutic oriented. And when you are in your 3,000 hours, when you pick an agency to go for, let's say if you were intending to become a licensed clinical social worker, right after you get your CAPSW, then you need to make sure that the place that you apply for and get hired for, that you'll actually be doing primary mental health treatment. So these are the type of agencies that typically certainly qualify: outpatient mental health clinics, inpatient psychiatric or treatment facilities, intensive in-home facilities. There are other possibilities to kind of thread the needle, and you can talk with me about them when you get to that stage, as long as you're an ASW member, because I talk to members. One of the services I do provide to NASW members, and I do it usually 3 or 4 times a week. I talk to members with questions about their application and what's going to qualify, things like that. Additional aspects. So the supervision that you would need to get would either be by a licensed clinical social worker, psychiatrist, psychologist. The rules do allow other people with written permission from the department or the social work section. And unlike like a decade ago, they're very freely giving that now as long as you apply ahead of time. Supervision should average 1 hour per week over the course of the 3,000 hours. You could do it more in the beginning, less at the end. If you're doing, part-time work, then I would say you probably should do 1 hour per 40 hours. It doesn't say that in the rules. Nobody thought about it when they put the rules in, but kind of common sense. That's what I would suggest. You can have group supervision up to 6 people. Video conferencing was allowed for supervision. If you are going, if that's what's going to happen, you should check with DSPS at that time to see if they're still allowing it when you reach that point. Now, as a certified or licensed social worker, you are required to report child abuse and neglect. You can get a temporary certificate while you're waiting to pass the national exam for up to 9 months. All clinical social workers must have malpractice insurance, $1 million per incident, up to $3 million. If your employer offers it, you're not required to get your own personal malpractice insurance, but NASW strongly recommends you do so because agencies will cover themselves, protect themselves first before they'll protect you. Continue education, and there's more information about this in my PowerPoint, but you're required to do 30 hours of continue education every 2-year continuing education cycle, including 4 hours of boundaries and ethics. It's not required during your first 2-year period. Right now, we're in a period that goes from July 1, 2023 to February 28th, 2025. If any of you get certified during that time, you won't have to worry about that particular time period because they don't prorate it or anything. But starting March 1 of 2025, then you're going to start needing to worry about it because you're going to need to accumulate the 30 hours by February 8, 2027. One of the important reasons to get certified, to get credentialed, even if your title of your program is not social worker, is that you have privileged communication. Your clients have privileged communication in your records. This is not true if you're not a certified social worker. So it's additional protection for client records. There is a provision for psychometric testing that you have to apply for certain types of tests to be able to do them, but there's other tests that social workers routinely use that you don't have to be certified for. There's tests on treatment planning, clarified treatment goals, et cetera, et cetera. But there are other more clinical ones that you need a letter from your supervisor and you need to follow certain qualifications. That's in MPS 1.11. If you get to that point and you're an ASW member and you have questions, you can call me and either I'll get you the answer or I'll get it for you. Now, MPS W20 is the conduct code for certified licensed social workers. This is your document. It's much shorter than ASW Code of Ethics, but it talks about things that you cannot do. There is an updated version that has been passed, and some of the information here has not been clearly updated. The thing in dispute now is we put into that well, the examining board did, but it was NASW who asked them to do so, a ban on conversion therapy, and that's temporarily suspended, but we have a lawsuit that I think eventually will be successful. The record keeping has changed slightly from this, but this is to give you a general rule. And you have to have records, documenting assessment, diagnosis, treatment, progress notes. They should be done in a timely fashion. The old rule talked about you need to do it 1 week following client contact. That's prudent practice. The new rule is not quite as specific. Clinical records should be maintained for at least 7 years after the last service, unless there's a different federal law. Now, NASW's malpractice insurance says don't get rid of them at all. Why? Because people can come back and try to sue you, after that period of time. But the state law would be 7 years. Now, if you've taken the state exam, it's been 5 years, you don't need to retake it. If you didn't have, so some people will go through their MSW program and maybe they're in macro or something else that's not really clinical. Maybe it's child welfare or maybe school social work. Maybe at some point they decide they want to become an LCSW. If they didn't take the psychopathology and social work and 1 or 2 of the other clinical classes, you can do that after you get your MSW, and some people do that in order to, at that point, try to become an LCSW. If you didn't have a field placement that was psychotherapeutic oriented in your graduate program, and I just talked to somebody who didn't, you will need to do an extra 1,500 hours in addition to the 3,000 hours. So you need to do 4,500 hours of supervised clinical practice and 1,500 hours of client contact. So it does enable you to make that switch. You just have to work longer under supervision. Now, reimbursement. Most insurance companies and HMOs, but not all, will reimburse CAPSWs providing psychotherapy at state certified outpatient clinics. Some of it is based on the advocacy of the clinic owner and how good they are. I know a clinic owner here in Dane County who has successfully negotiated for all of the HMOs are reimbursing her CAPSWs, which they weren't doing before. The Department of Health Services will reimburse CAPSWs for MA clients at state certified clinics. So that's definite. The insurance companies, HMOs, some will, some won't, but and some clinics have been able to negotiate, so all of their CAPSWs, all the work they do, all the HMOs do reimburse them at their clinic. As I said, insurance companies, LCSWs, we have a very strong LCSW in Wisconsin. You are entitled for all sorts of different reimbursement. Insurance companies must directly reimburse them. Department of Health Services must directly reimburse LCSWs, both for people in private practice, but also in home and in the public schools. And years ago, DHS refused to do that, and we had to go to the legislature actually to pass the bill to force them to do so. State Medicaid services does reimburse for telemental health services, and to the credit of the Evers administration, they changed the policy when COVID came in to make it permanent. That's not true all over the country. Medicare is currently reimbursing for telemental health. They started this during COVID, and there are national efforts to make this reimbursement permanent through bills and stuff, but it's still covered. Insurance companies are currently reimbursing for telemental health. We at ASWB have been watching this carefully. We want to make sure that they don't, we've been, we've been worried that they would suddenly start not wanting to reimburse or reimburse a lower level. It hasn't happened yet, but we are watching, and I've been in communication both with with the Office of Commissioner Insurance and our national office about this. As a certified any public or private mental health or healthcare agency or anybody that employs a social worker has duty to report terminations for cause to DSPS. So if any of you become a supervisor, an agency, and you fire someone because for unprofessional conduct, you're required to report them to DSPS. Also, if you suspend or restrict their contract, then you're also required to report them. Again, if the person resigns before you fire them, you still have to report them if they engage in unprofessional conduct. This is where you report the DSPS. I'd suggest you go onto the website and you can find the information about how to report, file a complaint. For applications, the application procedure is now online, which you go through something called License E, just not mentioned in this PowerPoint, which has made it tremendously quicker and simpler to get licensed. The department has also caught up. Fortunately, none of you were, well, I don't know if any of you were, if some of you are in the MSW program returning, you might have, but 3 or 4 years ago, it was a total nightmare to apply. The process was paper form. The department was completely understaffed. They had been trying to hire additional staff. They had the money in their bank account, but the state legislature has authority, position authority. They have to approve any staff that the departments want to hire. And they didn't want to give them the authority, even though they needed to hire the people. They basically, it was easier. They preferred basically demeaning DSPS in public and, complaining about government bureaucrats and actually giving them the staff that they needed. They had something like a 50%, no, the applications doubled in 5 years, and the number of staff they're allowed to have barely went up, and they had plenty of money for it. The State Journal reported they had a $24 million surplus, but they weren't allowed to spend it. And I spent hours lobbying on this. I've testified on it. It's basically a travesty. Things are doing better now because the system is online, and secondly, the department, Governor Evers allowed the department to use COVID ARPA monies to hire staff, both to answer the phones, which weren't being answered because they didn't have the staff to do that, and process the applications. The COVID monies will be running out at the end of this year, so I don't know what the department's going to do. The governor has repeatedly put requests in his budget for more staff. Now, if we get a new legislature, we'll definitely have more balanced legislature with the maps that have been created. The Democrats could take back the assembly. The Senate would take 2 elections because only half the people are up. Or it would be helpful if the Republicans that get put on joint finance would be operate in a more open-minded rather than ideological fashion towards DSPS. So here's information on the fees. You should regularly check that because it does change. It can change. So you should, check the fees. Now, there's two exams that people take to be licensed in Wisconsin. The first one is the state law exam. It's called the jurisprudence exam. This is open book. It's basically testing your knowledge of Wisconsin law that applies to social work practice, like child abuse and neglect law, like alcohol and drug abuse law, adult protective services, the state conduct code, things like that. Very practical, useful things that you need to know. And you can look up the answers, but then you'll know where to find them. I usually recommend that people who, before they take the exam, that you just go through the parts of the statute and regulation book, and it's listed. It's everything's online, and when you go to the website at dsps.wi.gov and you click on professions and you scroll down to one of the social work professions and you click on that, and then you'll see a section for Wisconsin Statutes Administrative Code. And then you'll see also information. The Statutes Administrative Code is where you're going to get your answers from. And then also in that section on the website, it'll section about exams, and it'll specifically tell you on the state exam what sections of the statute administrative code book they'll be asking questions from. So you can exit and return over a 3-month period. Most people do it in one sitting. So it'll be taken after your application is submitted. You'll be given permission you should still receive a password ID, and you'll be given permission to take the exam. Some people used to purchase the booklet through the document sales. I don't think probably nobody else does that anymore because people are so used to just looking up the information online. Passing grade is 85%. I don't get complaints from anybody about not passing this exam, as contrasted with the national exam, which I'll get to in a minute. And here's the information that I mentioned that is also found on the DSPS website. So it'll be taken from chapters 48, 55, 51, 880, and 93, and from the professional code book MPSW 1820 and chapter 457. So just review these chapters before you take the exam. Just make it a lot quicker for you to pass the exam. Now, national exam, big deal. It's expensive, $230 for the first 3 categories and $260 for the clinical. It is timed. It's 170 questions, 3.5 hours. If you don't pass it, you have to wait 90 days. Once your application is in, you'll get authorization from DSPS to contact ASWB, the National Test, to make the appointment. It's in person, and there's various test sites in Wisconsin. I'm sure there's one in the Madison area. Preparing for the national exam. Well, there's different ways of doing that. There is, I guess there's an e-booklet now for $15 through ASWB. There used to be a hardcover. Last I checked, it wasn't available. We do have exam preparation workshops. We're offering them free to NASW members. And we offer them at the annual conference. There's also one coming up this spring. And we have a professor that helps people with how to take the exam, how to prepare for it. You can take the exams prior to graduation. I kind of recommend that you do that if you can, because then when you're applying for jobs, you can say, I've already passed the exams. All I'm waiting for is UW-Madison to verify my MSW. And then, as I mentioned, you contact ASWB to register for the national exam. So when you go to the website, these are the different exams, the the ASWB bachelor's and the ASWB master's examination. Very, very few of you will be doing the advanced journalist, hardly anybody. So you got to remember you're the ASWB master's exam is for the CAPSW, and ASWB clinical, which is pretty evident for the LCSW. Now, there's been a specialty classification, but it's kind of because of a law that we got passed, you probably don't need it. But the specialty classification, if you want to be considered a specialist, you have to pass the ICRC examination, 1,000 hours of face-to-face counseling experience, 180 hours of AODA special education. Some people also just choose to get the CADC itself, and that's here. So you can become a substance abuse counselor credential if you want to. You have to pass the ICRC exam, 360 hours of education in this area, 3,000 hours of supervised practice, but less number of hours. If you have a BSW, you get 1,000 hours credit, MSW 2,000 hours. You can do some treatment without that. Now, we got a law passed that basically says that, well, first of all, LCSWs can provide psychotherapy without either the specialty or the CADC, which is the credential. And we got a law passed a session ago that also says a CAPSW also doesn't need the substance abuse credential in order to practice. Now, the only issue is whether the employer would require that. And some of the state certified alcohol and drug abuse clinics may do so. They shouldn't, because the law says that a CAPSW can provide it this without getting additional credentialing. But I'm not 100% sure that all the substance use clinics actually have changed their requirements. That's just something to keep in mind. Criminal offenses, you can still practice social work if you've had criminal offenses, depending on what they are. In the past, sometimes they've asked individuals to appear in person to explain their circumstances, but I think they probably do most of this through the paperwork. Let me just go back to there. It's basically, it depends on if the criminal offense is directly related to the work you're going to do as a social worker. I mean, if you sexually assaulted someone or be convicted of child abuse and neglect, you might have a really hard time getting certified or licensed. And there could be some other offenses. If you did shoplifting as a youth and you're a lot older now, that's not gonna, you have to report that, but that's not gonna keep you back from being certified or licensed. So reciprocity, for all practical purposes, we don't have it in Wisconsin. It's extremely rare. I mean, all of you are here in Wisconsin, but you got a friend moving to town. There's only a few states where we consider to have reciprocity. So somebody coming from another state, even if they would meet all our requirements, they're going to have to go through the whole process. Someday that will change when we have a compact, which I hope will be by the end of the next legislative session. Okay. Continue education. Ethics needs to be interactive. It needs to be either in person or a live webinar, which we do provide. The other 26 hours could be home study. I don't recommend it. I don't think it's a good idea. You're missing the in-person experience, but you can't do it that way. You do have to keep records of your continuing education for 4 years in case you are audited. At the end of the 2-year cycle, you only need to check a box, attesting that you did the 30 hours, including 4 hours bodies and ethics. But if you are audited, you have to provide the proof, which means you have to provide the records, the certificates that showed you had the hours by the, officially signed by the agency. And preferably you should have information on the coursework, because they want to make sure that the coursework would count. If you do more than 30 hours in the period, you can't carry that over. As I mentioned, there's no continuing education requirement during the time receiving the initial credential and the commencement of the 2-year period. The credentialing period is March 1 of the odd year to February 28th. So the next one after the one we're in now will start March 1st, 2025, go to February 28th, 2027. So continuing education, what programs are acceptable? Well, programs need to be pre-approved, number one. The programs have to be relevant to the practice of marriage, family therapy, professional counseling, and social work. But when you get to that point, and if you're going, NASW is automatically approved, colleges and universities, as long as it relates to social work practice. I mean, you take something at a college on first aid, that's not going to count. Or you take a language, it should count, but they don't necessarily going to count that. But if it's related to this, anything NASW does, the college or university, you don't have to worry. Other than that, it has to be pre-approved. The other thing doesn't have to be approved, that a public or private agency can provide up to 15 of your 30 hours as in-service training, and they don't have to get it pre-approved, but the other 15 they would for it to count. So I'm going to stop my share, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the presentation. If anybody's interested in what's going on with the alternative licensure compact, you can ask me about that, or the compact. I'm sorry, the alternative licensure exam. You can ask me about that. But first, let me see if there's any questions about certification or licensure period from anybody. And I can't see.
I can see the chat. Do you want me to kind of read through some of them?
Please.
So one question is from Emily. Will we get the PowerPoint after the presentation?
Sure.
Actually, and it's already going to be, since this is being recorded, it's also a part of this.
I see
Recording.
Daly has a question.
There's more there. Should I do the chat first, or do you want to go ahead?
Oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I have another question is there a maximum time frame, like within 2 years as an example, to complete the 3,000 hours?
No, you can take more time. There isn't a requirement that it be completed in 2 years. Some people do it part-time. Maybe they're, working part-time.
So it could take 4 years or 5 years?
Yep. Yeah, you could do it then.
Okay, another question. As long as I am supervised with an LCSW, can I obtain my 3,000 hours while working in my own business?
Yes. Yeah. So say you set up your own counseling business, as a CAPSW, a few people are doing that these days. You can, if you have an LCSW supervisor, that will count, as long as you're doing the psychotherapy. Just make sure if you set up your own practice that you follow rules and regulations and prudent practice, and get some advice about how to do that in an ethical manner. But some people have done that, where they've set up their own private practice under supervision, and they're doing psychotherapy with clients under supervision.
Okay, great. Thanks. There's just one more in the chat, and then we can take the others. Another question is, I have seen individuals designated as IT, that is LCSW-IT, at some outpatient group practices. What does that mean? And can those individuals bill insurance for providing psychotherapy?
Well, there's no such thing as an LCSW-IT. There is an LPC and an LMFT IT in training. So the when you get, for those who are going to become an LPC or LMFT, they get an MA degree, they get an LMFT IT or an LPC IT, which is equivalent to a CAPSW. And so they can provide psychotherapy under supervision, but the social workers, you get a CAPSW, which is equivalent to the LPCIT, LMTIC, and that's once you have that, you can get your start seeing clients.
Okay, great. Thank you. Those were all the questions in the chat. Now we had some people with their hands up, but I'm not seeing right now.
Daly had their hand up, but I don't know if that, yeah, Daly has the hand up. You can unmute Daly. I'll answer your question.
Okay.
Whoop, you just muted yourself. There you go.
There we go. Sorry. I just had a quick kind of opinion question for you. I'm wondering, I'm not planning to stay in Wisconsin, but I'm currently in the MSW program graduating in May, and I was wondering your opinion on if you feel that it's smarter to stay in Wisconsin and complete licensure and get licensed and then move to another state and like get the license there, or if it's smarter just to move right away. Like, just based on your opinion, what do you think is like
I mean, I think it depends on, you might want to contact that state. And if you're an NASW member, you can contact the NASW chapter, but each state handles that a little bit differently. It should be very easy to go between a CAPSW at the entry level master's level. It should be pretty easy to transfer to whatever their credential is at the entry level master's level, because every state has different, many states have different credentials. Very few people call it LCSW, some call it LMSW, or they're all different things, but it's because the requirements are so basic, which is different than at the LCSW level. It shouldn't be hard to do that. But I would check. I mean, one of the things is that you may not be able to work in that other state until you get their certification or licensure. And so I'm not sure whether it'll make a difference if whether there would be a reason why you would need to do it. The only reason why you might want to do it is so you've taken the national exam and passed it. And then you wouldn't have to do that in the other states. You've gotten that out of the way. That'd be the only reason I could kind of see. But I definitely would contact that other state. But that's the one thing that you're not going to have to retake the national exam if you move to another state. You've passed it.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Sure.
There are a couple more questions in the chat. One is, how do I go about getting advice for starting my own private practice in psychotherapy as a CAPSW going later for the LCSW?
Well, first of all, join NASW because we have tremendous resources for you. The national office for members has a monthly private practice webinar where there's a lot of valuable information for, particularly for people like you who are going to be starting a practice like that. We also have a clinical network where people are, it's a listserv, and I send questions to them all the time. And then you can also connect with people. If you come to our annual conference, this year it's October 21st, 22nd, 23rd in Milwaukee. On every Monday, the first day of the conference, we have a clinical network luncheon, and you can network with all these other clinical social workers. You meet them, and you can make some good connections. But I would, definitely want to connect with NASW, and you'd probably want to get a mentor to help you with the process. Get all the resources that the national office has on their members only section of the website on starting private practice. Read everything you can about that. Come ask questions at the monthly private practice section, and you can ask Miriam Coleman, who's the clinical specialist, questions as well as contacting me, and then I'll forward you to the clinical network. Somebody asked go ahead. I'll let you, Belinda, do the chat.
Oh, is there somebody else that has a question? But there's a couple more that have popped up.
My contact information is M Herstand, MHERSTAND. It's my last name, dot NASWWI@socialworkers.org. And you can also find it on the NASW Wisconsin website.
Yeah, we can send that information out to students too. Another question is, should I receive my LCSW if I am going into pediatric social work?
All right, that's a very good question. And it's not a simple question. If you're thinking that you might want to do therapy with children or families of infants, or work in the area of infant mental health, yeah, you probably do. If you want to be able to supervise people who are going for the 3,000 hours, then you need to go for your LCSW. One of the challenges that are out there is we found that some hospitals have required for some of their positions the LCSW when they really didn't need to do so. So that's something you might want to look at, the places of employment. But the LCSW in our state is really designed for people that are going to be doing therapy, mental health counseling with their clients. Also, you have to, if you want to be a supervisor for someone, you have to have an LCSW, and there will be a requirement in the future that you have to have at least 3 years full-time experience. If you're not doing therapy at all, you don't need to get the LCSW. And as my only caveat is, unfortunately, there are some employers, like some hospitals, that have put that in their job requirement, and we said you don't need to do that. And so I can't tell you about that exactly, but I can say that that gives you a general idea when you absolutely should versus when you don't really maybe need to.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Thank you, Mark. Another question, which I think it's addressed in the DSPS and you addressed it also. What do you recommend for studying for these exams?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's different things you can do. And there are very expensive manuals you can buy for several $100s. I can't recommend you do that or not do that. You get the very inexpensive booklet from ASWB. You can take our exam prep workshop if you'd like. It's probably helpful. It's probably a good idea to take the exam. Don't wait for years after you graduate, because some of the information will be that you learned in graduate school or in the undergraduate program will be helpful for you in doing that. So that's about what I can tell you for the national exam. It's a basically multiple choice, pick the best answer for this situation. What would you do first? It's kind of thinking through things. Our exam prep professor, who's very good, she kind of tries to help people think through how to approach the questions on the exam.
Great. Another question that we have is, what if a position requires LCSW but is not needed? Would NASW need to get involved to let the agency know that it is not needed for social workers?
Yeah, if you're a member of NASW and you find that, contact me and I would contact the employer. I've done that in a few cases where I've seen that, and I've contacted the employer and said, you really don't need to require an LCSW. Frankly, in some cases, I mean, they probably, well, let me put it this way. there's some very qualified people who don't have LCSWs, and if they're requiring an LCSW of someone who doesn't have that qualifications, they're making a big mistake. You know, if you have a hospital type of department, and you know somebody's worked in oncology or worked in any of the different areas, hematology, or and they have all this great experience, but they don't have an LCSW. You hire someone LCSW who's never worked in that field, that area. It's a mistake. So I can't say I can create miracles, but I would advocate and talk to them and I didn't say, hey, I know a really good applicant, but they don't have an LCSW, but they've got all this experience. You should really think about make that as maybe preferred but not required.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't have any more. There are no more questions in the chat. Does anybody else have any other questions? Well, I want to thank you, Mark, for giving such a great informative presentation to our
Yeah.
group. Yeah, and I
Sure.
think I'll go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. And appreciate the opportunity. Please join NASW. We have your back. We will be advocating for you throughout your career. We also are a big social justice organization that I know a lot of you care about, and we, in addition to advocating strongly for profession, we also do that kind of work. I just did a presentation about that this morning, but particularly, with any kind of professional issues that come up, clinical or ethical or practice issues, you need help on anything, we're here for you. So please join, and good luck in your program.
Thank you all.